and welcome to this afternoon session. It's a privilege, and it's lovely to introduce my colleagues here. Jane Mulcahy is going to be our first speaker. Jane is going to talk about neurodiversity and trauma and the interlinking between these issues, and particularly thinking about relational issues that people can have and what we can do about that. We then move on to Tom McMillan. Tom and I have been working together for 20 years or more now, one way or another. Tom's going to talk about how the police consider brain trauma, screen for brain trauma, and what they also feel they need to know more about. And then Hope, who I have the privilege of having as my PhD candidate, and also absolutely wonderful at organising us, is going to talk about our recent project with Devon Police here in the UK. So now I'm going to shift over to Jane, and I don't know if you want to share your screen.
Sure. Okay, can you see that, guys?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, great. So I'm delighted to be here. I am currently working as a Youth Justice Research Fellow at the University of Limerick, but I'm going to primarily talk a little bit about some of the findings from my PhD on long sentence male prisoners in Ireland. Now, my sample was pretty small. I only had 12 men who I interviewed before their release from prison, and I tried to follow up with them afterwards. But that proved kind of difficult because their lives went quite chaotic. They returned to drugs and that type of thing when they got out of prison. But I'm going to really try and restory antisocial personality attitudes and behavior as normal trauma responses, or at least raise the questions, can we possibly do so? And the quote at the bottom of the page there is from a guy called Dahi, who was he was stabbed in prison multiple times by a gang, and this changed him. It changed him fundamentally. He went from feeling comparatively safe in the presence of others to feeling completely unsafe around other people. And the quote here, which is maybe quite hard to read because I transcribed everything quite naturalistically, but basically it was just about dreaming about being back in prison, being moved to the prison where it happened, and having the feeling of being pinned down, the feeling of having all these dangerous weapons pulled on him, and how that made him feel. And it didn't make him feel good at all. So the second slide here, which I don't expect you to look at really, is just some examples of how I've combined my research with activism, articles, submissions, and podcasts. I'll share these slides if anyone is interested, but of particular relevance really to what I'm going to be talking about is developmental and relational trauma, but also polyvagal theory and state-dependent functioning, which is relevant to all of us because we are not, our personalities aren't the same depending on what we experience. Our reactions change depending on how safe we feel among other people. And there is a certain dynamic nature to this. Safety is contingent, and our ability to relate well to other people, or to learn, or to think through consequences must, in my view, be seen through this kind of reality. So just a tiny note about what my PhD involved. Initially, I set out to kind of look at things like rehabilitation, sentence planning, interagency working, and post-release supervision, because I was co-funded by the Probation Service and the Irish Research Council. So I did a lot of interviews as well with frontline service providers and policymakers. It was only really midway through my interviews that when I started talking to the men themselves, that very quickly stuff around childhood adversity and trauma came up. When I asked them why they were there, as in why they were in prison, it was to do with drug addiction. And at the root of drug addiction was where the trauma really came in. So many of them mentioned misuse of particularly benzodiazepines, which I wasn't really expecting, and that the combination of alcohol and benzos made them very kind of confrontational and violent when they would have described themselves as kind of nice guys otherwise. And one of they also spoke about how benzos made them feel fearless or invincible. And I learned from Frank Corrigan, who does deep brain reorienting, that benzos operate on the fear centers of the brain, which is quite interesting, because when guys are growing up in dangerous surroundings and in places like prisons where violence can erupt, it's quite interesting that the kind of misuse of benzodiazepines, and by that I mean fistfuls of them, can allow repressed rage to come to the surface, but in very dangerous, volatile ways. Another thing that's very important is that the risk needs responsivity model, which I had the pleasure of studying in detail alongside probation officers, it kind of fails to attend to attachment or interpersonal neurobiology. It fails to attend to the impact of an overdose of childhood adversity and the absence of an always available, emotionally stable adult to kind of buffer the person. And the thing is, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the dominant response by probation officers in particular, it will not work on a traumatized person whose prefrontal cortex goes offline at the very small provocations, because to be in our cortical thinking brain, and I am no expert in this, we do need to feel safe. We need to be regulated. If we're dysregulated upon release from prison, well, all bets are off. We will reach for our coping strategy of choice, which for so many prisoners is some sort of combination of drugs. So this slide has a lot on it, just the big four and the central eight. They focus, the R&R focuses on antisocial behavior, which is static risk factor, but past behavior is a pretty good indicator of future behavior. Antisocial personality, antisocial attitudes, and antisocial peers. Lesser risk factors as part of the central eight include family and marital problems, addiction or mental health issues, schoolwork, and poor use of leisure time and that type of thing. In relation to childhood adversity then, the Welsh study showed that people with 4 or more ACEs were 14 times more likely to have been a victim of violence over the previous year and 15 times more likely to have committed violence against another person. Their risk of being incarcerated was far greater than people with no adversity, and their risk of using crack cocaine or heroin was also high. But our bodies, and this is all of us, not just prisoners or people with offending behavior, our bodies need to feel safe in the presence of other people. And our vagus nerve, which is a giant nerve that kind of goes from our guts up to our brainstem and everything in between, this has a really big impact on how we feel, how we detect safety or danger in our environment. And if we've not had the good fortune of feeling safe in our primary attachment relationship, that sets us up for feeling unsafe in all future relationships, because we might feel that other humans are dangerous or volatile or make us feel small or can't be trusted. And if we're fortunate enough to have been safe in childhood, but then something bad happens, like the man who was viciously assaulted in prison, that also makes us feel very unsafe in the presence of other people. But essentially, our memory templates from childhood follow us into adulthood, and memory, according to Dan Siegel, is the way past events affect future functioning. I don't have much time, so just a couple of slides here. This one is one guy, Cahill, who was one of the more minor offenders. He had over 200 convictions for drug-related thefts, but no violence in his background. But he said his at the root of his drug addiction was domestic violence. I can't really see that. Is it 1 minute or 2? One, okay. Domestic violence was at the root of his offending behavior and the lack of someone to hug him. This slide here then is about a man, Tig, who was convicted of manslaughter, of armed robbery and drug-related crime. So he had done nearly 20 years in prison. His mother had been a suicidal single parent. He had to rob food as a child. he had no father there to support him, and he felt let down by everyone. And so this idea of agency, not wanting to live a different life, is quite interesting, in the sense that he just kind of was fed up with the lack of supports all around him. I'll end on this one. This chap was a very young man. He was 22. He'd spent 6 out of his teenage years in detention. He had been very, very angry with psychiatrists all his life, had ADHD diagnosis, but he told me he had a great childhood. Now, something doesn't quite jive there, because ADHD diagnosis is, according to Nadine Burke-Harris, a bit of a red flag for trauma. And children in the Center for Youth Wellness in California, those who had 4 or more ACEs were 32 times more likely to be diagnosed with a learning or behavioral disorder like ADHD. But he did find engagement with psychology very useful and beneficial, but still did not feel very safe in the world. So this slide is about state-dependent functioning and how all of our behavior is contingent on how safe or unsafe we feel, and how our actual intellect, our IQ, goes down with feelings of terror, because we don't have any need for being intellectual when what we need to do is survive a life threat. I leave it there. Thank you, and I can take any questions, or we can leave them to the end, depending.
Yep. We have time for a couple of questions, maybe a quick question.
Sure.
Or comment. If you want to unmute, don't be a mutant. Unmute.
They can't unmute, but they can raise their hand and I can give them permission to speak if they have a vocal question.
There we go. Thank you very much. Raise your hand if you like. Well, it's all fantastically clear. I just have a comment, and that comment is there is some really nice work kind of showing how, in context of adverse life experiences, especially trauma experiences where things are done to someone of lesser power, a child, a woman, and so on and so forth, there's overlaps between traumatic brain injury and adverse experiences. So there's a huge issue to try to disentangle that which is chronic trauma, that which is brain injury, but they interlink. So in our work, we've shown how brain injury and PTSD are very close kind of cousins, and in fact become somehow kind of contributed to each other. And so down the line, you have maybe interventions that both are helpful from a problem-solving CBT perspective, but also needs to be about the attachment issues and the vagal nerve stuff about kind of de-escalating situations. It's very hard to de-escalate the situation if you're already on 10 out of 10 anger. The Secure Stairs program in the UK youth system has been evolved to try to be more like that, and more information we can give you about on that. But that was really fascinating. Kind of thank you very much. I have questions too. And that's the Vigeland Park sculpture, wasn't it? Statue in Oslo. The baby.
The angry baby.
Fantastic, fantastic. Anyway, so we're going to shift on to Tom, Professor Tom McMillan, who has done huge amounts of research in all kinds of areas in brain trauma. So Tom, you're going to tell us about your research in this area, when you can start to share a screen. And I don't know if you're muted, but Tom is at University of Glasgow and has worked on traumatic brain injury and PTSD, in homelessness, in people who offend, and so on and so forth, and it's been very influential in British neuropsychology and international neuropsychology. Tom, are you ready? If not, I will just go on about you. It's all right. And Tom has also produced a fantastic study on death after traumatic brain injury that people might be interested in, similar to Sina Fassel, but showing that if you survive your brain injury, you still die before your time. So lots of different areas that Tom has been involved with, and it's a pleasure to have him give us a talk today.
Can you see that now?
Yes, we can see that, Tom. That's great. That's lovely. Thank you.
You can see it, top?
Yeah. Yes. Yep. And we can see it and we can hear you, Tom.
Okay, I'm just waiting. It's gone dead on my screen, but it'll be just 1 second. It's so slow.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. Tom and I also go along to rugby together, so we may have heard. And I'm hoping that Tom's wonderful Scotland wins tonight against France. So Wales can win the Six Nations. Anyway, are you ready there, Tom?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, perfect.
So I'm just going to talk to you about a survey that we did in
we kind of lost
Scotland.
part of the screen. I'm sorry, Tom. Eli, is that working, Eli, for everybody else, or is it just me that's affected?
No, it seems that it is kind of frozen with just a quarter of the screen being available.
Do you want to maybe unclick?
Maybe try unsharing and share again.
Yeah. There we go. So we can see it fully now. Can you go through it like that?
Okay? Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, is that okay? Sorry.
Yeah, that's perfect.
So,
yeah, carry on.
Survey we did in Scotland on training needs of police officers working in police custody. The context of this is part of a programme of work that we've been doing with the Scottish Government, which is really attempting to develop a service for offenders with brain injury in the criminal justice system. And there's a report that we produced in 2016, and we've been working through the recommendations of the report. And one of them is to do with training of staff about head injury. So just as a preliminary, we did an observational pilot survey in police custody in Glasgow. And there is a vulnerability risk assessment that the sergeant carries out and asks about 20 different questions. But at that time, they didn't ask about head injury, only about injury. So we asked them to introduce a question on head injury, knocks to the head in the last 48 hours, and found that 13% of people, detainees, said they'd had a knock to the head. And the police have got a number of options that I've listed there that they can act on if they're concerned about somebody. And these are cases where it's not just completely obvious that they have to take them to A&E. The point of this really is that if we scaled this up, and if it was representative, and it was not a huge sample, so it may not be, but in Scotland, which is a population overall of 6 million, we'd be talking about 18,000 people going through police custody a year who've recently had a knock to the head. So we're talking about large numbers of people. So the police have now included a question on head injury in their vulnerability risk assessment in Scotland. And if the question is asked affirmatively, there are a number of linked questions that they can then ask to find out more about the seriousness of it. But that's all very fine, but what do the police actually know about head injury? So what we did is we did a survey of police custody centres throughout Scotland and wanted to know what training on head injury was provided to police custody officers, what their perception was of training need, and an indication of what they knew about head injury. And we had basically 3 questionnaires that we filled in. One is kind of basic demographic background information and what they thought the training needs were. The common misconception about...
Tom, sorry, just 1 second. If you want to progress the slides, or because we're all still stuck on the first one, or you could just...
You're still on the first one? Well, I'm in number 4, so I don't know what's happening.
Yeah. I don't know if that's not connecting up. Go out. I don't know. There's suggesting in the chat box about shifting from. Oh, right. Eli, any thoughts on that?
He could try to stop sharing and then share again. It could just be a bandwidth issue. It could be that things just aren't moving as quickly because of, a lack of strong internet connection.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
There it goes.
Moving. Okay, it's moving
Is
now.
that better now?
Yeah, we moved on to
Slide
people fighting. Slide 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry about that.
That's right.
So this is really the slide telling you about the context and the program of research.
Okay.
Problem is I can't move my slides now.
Okay. Don't worry. Just tell us about what you found, Tom. What did you find?
Oh, there we go.
Oh.
This is the slide about the observational study. And this is us back up to scratch now. The 3 questionnaires that we sent out to folk: demographic background, the common misconceptions about TBI. And this is a standard questionnaire. It's been used in a number of different studies. It's a fairly general questionnaire, kind of general knowledge about TBI. And then the third one is one devised for the study that focuses much more on police custody and information that's relevant to the police custody setting. And so the Police Scotland sent out bachelor forms to the 12 area clusters in Scotland, the police custody areas. This gives you kind of details of really the procedure of carrying out the study. So I'll just skip past that as we've maybe lost a bit of time. And we had, we were trying to get some responses from each custody centre, which we did. We had 67 people responded. And when we look at training, what training they said they had, there's 37% there said they had no training whatsoever. And those who said they had training, it was very general, basic training, really not specialist training about head injury at all. And so not surprisingly, high proportions of the police officers said that they felt they needed more training. In fact, everyone said they needed training in some way. 40% thought they needed to train all the areas that are listed there. And high proportions, particularly in areas of assessment, early management and long-term effects of brain injury. So if we look at the general questionnaire, the CMTBI questionnaire, 88% of the sample made 1 or more errors, and about half the sample made errors in these domains that the questionnaire can be divided into. So insight, sequelae of brain injury, recovery, and hidden disability. Now, the things, there's a different number of questions per domain. So if you take account of that by looking at the number of errors per question, which gives you a little bit of assistance really against guessing or random error, you find that the most common area really with in the areas of insight. There's been very few studies done on people working in the criminal justice system, but O'Rourke et al. Did one study on probation officers, and they similarly found that insight is the area where errors were most commonly made. The knowledge questionnaire, if you remember, is more specific to police custody, and there 98% of the sample made 1 or more errors, and the error rate per question was twice as high. So despite this being more relevant to police custody, the error rate was higher. So that kind of underpins really a need for training of police custody staff. And we're talking about really people where the consequence of the head injury isn't entirely obvious.
Yeah.
It's not that they had to be rushed to emergency department straight away. These are some of the most common errors that were made and revealing kind of misconceptions that people had about brain injury. So you see there for some of them to do with insight. So thinking that people who have survived a brain injury show a good understanding of their problems. And the best thing to do is to ask them. That will give you the most information, the most accurate information. And we know from other studies that that's not generally true. And other questions to do with recovery, with sequelae and recovery.
Excellent.
In terms of the knowledge questionnaire, the highest proportion of errors that people made were really perhaps some confusion about when people should be taken to A&E, where it's not absolutely obvious that they need to go. Thinking that prisoners would report a recent head injury if you didn't ask them, which isn't true. Thinking that prisoners with a past history of head injury are not more likely to be a management problem, and they are. If talking sensibly about after a head injury, the prisoner will know where they are and who they're talking to, and that's not necessarily the case. And we know from sport, people can carry out skilled movements, they can answer some simple questions, and they can do that in a plausible way. And that's why, of course, we have cognitive testing in people who are concussed during the matches now. And also a surprisingly high number thinking that hallucinations are common in people with recent history of head injury. If we look at rank and experience, there weren't any differences in terms of rank or the experience that the participants had in terms of their responses on the questionnaires, and no differences in terms of people who reported some training or those who didn't, although the training that people had was very basic, so perhaps that's not surprising. So really just to sum up, police custody officers in Scotland perceive a need for training about head injury. They don't report having received specific training beyond first aid, so there's a clear need here. And responses in questionnaire suggest a number of misconceptions about head injury. And so this also supports the need for training, particularly as relevant to the police custody setting. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was fantastic. And thank you for dealing with all the technical issues as you're going along too so well. Seamless and really fascinating. Anybody want to ask some questions? If you put up your hand now, that'll be good. Thank you very much. And Eli will able to let us have your unmuted questions. No? I've got 2 or 3 if you don't mind, Tom.
I think we have got one here.
Yes, I've unmuted Lynn. She should be able to speak.
Thanks, Eli.
Good.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Tom. That was really fantastic. As always, you are doing the work that we are just organizing, and you've already done it. So that's always good. I wondered if you could share the screening questions that you mentioned are now part of the risk and vulnerability assessment, and kind of how you managed to navigate getting the information without adding too much work for people in the system who don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the questions here, but really it's to enable the police sergeant to decide whether he wants to contact the forensic nurse or not. So it's 2 or 3 fairly simple questions that really allow him to do that. I can get the questions and forward them. I can't. My screen doesn't show me who's speaking actually.
Me neither. Yeah.
I can get the.
Tom, I was just in context of that question. If you don't mind, we might have a in-between meeting or a workshop at some point for LEFA, for the Neurodiversity Special Interest Group of LEFA, on some practical approaches in the area. If you would, if that was something that people might want, and or we could set up a Zoom meeting at some point to share information along these lines about how to maybe add some questions in that would then be quite useful for police and so on. If people are interested, please message us within the Hoover system, and then we can Hoover those up and then do something with them. Anybody else?
Lynn asking the question. Thanks, Lynn.
Great. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Lynn. Any other questions? Any other hands up? I was about to say, Tom, it really does absolutely show with importance, not just doing training, but actually doing a check on, well, what the training is actually giving people, isn't it? And insights being a key issue, and people have misperceptions, and the importance in the justice system of approved adults or somebody who is trained up to be able to now help someone navigate the way in justice setting. It may well be one of the big factors why people can just constantly running through the system. So thank you very much, Tom. Is this going to be published at some point soon?
Yeah, so I'm just waiting for comments back from the police training body and from the Scottish Government, and then I'm going to
excellent
publication. But I think you're right. I mean, obviously, a lot of attention, maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, been paid to understanding more about brain injury in offenders. Of course, we've really got to focus on what to do about it.
Understand. Yeah.
And that the people dealing with them are not going to be specialists.
No, exactly. Precisely. Tom, that's a really good point. And before we move on to the next talk, I would just remind people, if they look up Scottish Parliament's Justice Committee, Tom chaired a group for the Scottish Parliament in this area to bring together evidence to try to improve screening for brain injury across prison, probation, police systems, what training would be important to put in place, and really did a really total system review that was really brilliant. And the Scottish Parliament responded to it in a really practical and sensible manner, I think, as well, and then led to this work, Tom. So thank you very much, and really nice example of research to practice and policy. Thanks, Tom. And so we're now going to move on, and good luck tonight, Tom, of course. Hello, Lynn. Right, briefly. So now we're going to move to Hope. Hope Kent, who is my privilege to be the advisor on Hope's PhD. Hope is doing a PhD in the area of large data sets, so big data, and neurodiversity and criminal justice systems, but also works quite closely with me, and thank you very much for doing that, Hope, on a regular basis. On various projects that we have funded from the Barrow Cadbury Trust. So on this, I'll hand over to Hope, who can tell us about this project we just completed.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks, Hugh. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for having me. And I'm going to present some findings from this project, which we worked on with Devon and Cornwall Police, where we introduced some screening for TBI. And then I'm also going to go through and just talk about some of the resources that are out there that I think people should know about as well, which might be useful for people who are trying to implement change and get these sort of projects going in other police forces as well. So this project, we worked with Devon and Cornwall Police, and we worked with 2 teams within Devon and Cornwall Police. So they weren't frontline officers. We worked with the Pathfinder team, who run a deferred caution and charge scheme. So they sort of do psychosocial interventions, maybe substance use interventions, supporting people with accessing rehabilitative services, behaviour management sort of interventions, with people who are first-time offenders or who don't have particularly serious offences. So they work through a programme with them. And we also engage with the Integrated Offender Management Team, and that's a nationwide directive which works with the most sort of persistent and prolific offenders. So people who are coming up and coming into contact again and again and again to try and reduce the amount of contact they need with the police, and promote their engagement with rehabilitative services, and get them supported by more relevant social services. So we delivered this project in 3 key parts. So staff were invited to attend training, which was delivered by Hugh. That was in 3 parts, sort of telling them a bit about what traumatic brain injury was, why it's important in the justice system, why it's important to screen for it. And then we gave the staff a bit of training around how to use a tool called the BISI, which is the Brain Injury Screening Index, developed by the Disabilities Trust Foundation. There's a little link to it at the bottom of the page, and I'll talk a bit more about them a bit later on. But the BISI is a really nice tool. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes to complete, so it's quite brief, and it's not a diagnostic tool, but it does open that conversation about a person's history of head injury, and how severe that might be and how much that might be impacting on their functioning. So staff then used the BISI for a 3-month period to screen every new person who was picked up by their team. And then we conducted qualitative interviews as well to collect feedback on the training and screening process, and find out a bit more about how they found using the tool. So in terms of our findings from collecting the BISI from people in contact with those teams, we found that 54 out of the 91 screened had a mild or moderate TBI at some point in their lifetime. So that's about 60%, which is really high in comparison to the general population and about in line with what we normally find in justice settings. People in contact with the IOM team, who are the more persistent and severe offenders, had significantly more moderate, sort of more on the more severe end of the TBIs than people in contact with the Pathfinder team. And again, prevalence of mild TBI was really high in the Pathfinder team compared to the IOM team. So that graph probably explains that a bit more clearly than I just did, where the IOM team are in blue. So that's the sort of more persistent and severe offenders, and the Pathfinder team are in orange on that graph. So roughly equal levels had none, but then the mild and moderate TBI was split in quite an interesting way across the two teams. We also, perhaps the most important finding was that having a higher score on the BISI, so having a more severe history of head injury, was linked to having identified needs across more areas. So whether that's substance use, education needs, mental health, physical health, housing difficulties, having a higher TBI score was linked to having more needs in more different areas. And that's really interesting because of the sort of social and cognitive implications of TBI, which might mean that they're more vulnerable to having head injuries, or it might mean that they're having difficulty engaging with rehabilitation or changing that behaviour that might not be constructive, and generally being excluded from services for non-compliance, things like that. So quite important that. And there was no significant difference by gender, but this was really pilot data. It was really small data. So we only had 16 female people who screened and 1 non-binary person. So not really enough to draw any conclusions about that. The interviews with staff were really positive on the whole. They really enjoyed the training. They found it really useful. They thought it was relevant for them. But most importantly, they found the BISI was a really useful tool to open up conversations about somebody's history. So tying in a bit with what Jane said, asking them about situations where they might have experienced trauma or experienced a head injury, really opened up conversations that they wouldn't have normally had time for or made time for, and helped them to understand the people that they were working with a lot better, understand how they were functioning, and that reduced staff sort of feelings of stress and frustration as well, with not understanding why people were perhaps not remembering appointments or repeating things, or getting stuck in the same patterns of behaviour. So this just breaks down the identified needs profiles a little bit more. So again, the IOM team are in blue and the Pathfinder team are in orange. So you'd sort of expect those more persistent and severe people who are coming into contact with the police to have those more complex needs profiles, but that just shows it to you graphically as well. So our key takeaways for that was that there's a high prevalence in contact with both teams. So the screening was really worthwhile. It identified a huge portion of people who were experiencing these difficulties. More severe TBI was associated with identified needs across more different areas. The BISI was a really useful tool, and the increased awareness really helped staff with their understanding and helped them to work with people more productively. So I just spend a minute just going through some really helpful resources as well. So the first place that I'd like to talk about is the Disabilities Trust. So they're the people who've developed the Brain Injury Screening Index. It's there at the bottom of the screen, and on their website, these are just some examples of the pages they've got. They've got current research, pages on brain injury and offending, brain injury and homelessness, training for professionals. They offer sort of consultancy and e-learning and whatever sort of training your organisation might need. It's worth saying as well, the Brain Injury Screening Index is completely free to use. You just have to read through a little bit about how to deliver it. But it is free to use, and they're really supportive of people using it. Then I thought I'd highlight as well the Abused and Brain Injured Toolkit, which was developed by the ABI Research Lab in Canada. And this is a really wonderful site. It's very bite-sized, it's very accessible. They've got Brain Injury 101, which is like really quick information that's easy to absorb. It gives you facts and statistics about brain injury, and particularly in the context of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So it's a lovely place to be able to refer people to as well. It's very user-friendly for people who might be in unsafe situations at home. That quick exit button at the top there, I think, takes you to the local weather page, so they can get off the site really quickly if somebody comes in the room. There's care guidelines, stuff about community, although that might be a bit more relevant for Canada, and service provision as well. So it's a great resource both for professionals and to be able to refer people onto. So just worth highlighting. And finally, I'll just mention Do It Profiler as well. So they are a wonderful company who offer, again, consultancy, training, screening tools for all kinds of neurodisability. So zooming out a bit from just brain injury, they screen for all sorts of functional difficulties in a transdiagnostic way, which is lovely because practically that's what they need support with. So it identifies the areas of needs rather than focusing necessarily on one diagnosis. So yeah, that's a really great website as well to point out if you are interested in consultancy and training. And then finally, I'll just flash up our slide about our neurodiversity significant interest group, which we are all members of. And we have quite active discussions every couple of months, and we're working on a position paper at the moment. We spoke yesterday as well with Hugh, Stan and Nathan. So if you are interested in the topic, you'd like any more information, or you've got any questions about the group, then please do get in touch. My contact details are on the screen there, or you can get in touch via any of the speakers. But we would really love to hear from you, love to hear your feedback, and engage with anybody who's working in this area or is keen to work in this area. So I will just make a little plug for that there and leave my details up for a second, if that's okay. Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you, Hope. So if you want to put your hand up, if you have a question for Hope to do with the study or the toolkits that are available, or anything else. No. Oh, okay. Jane, you have a question?
I do. It's not so much related to the studies per se, but from my own new research and actually from the PhD as well, a lot of the men were involved in very dangerous behavior with cars and a lot of collisions. The guy with the 200 convictions for theft, he had plowed into a wall in his youth. And like, I wasn't tuned into brain injury at all, but I'm just wondering how, and in the new study with young people, joyriding and stealing of cars is a big thing. So I'm just wondering, is that a common area aside from the domestic abuse where people sustain head injuries?
Definitely, and we've actually just published a paper which Hugh is on as well, where we've looked at parental supervision. So adolescents who have poorer parental supervision, parents less involved, don't know where they're going or what they're doing. They're choosing riskier behaviours, they're at higher risk of brain injury and then of poorer outcomes after brain injury. And there's sort of a specific link there with the dangerous driving or getting the car with somebody who's been using substances and all of that sort of thing, particularly in the presence of peers as well. So yeah, that's a huge area. I don't know if you've got anything you wanted to add to that, Hugh, but definitely one of the key causes. I
think that was a really nice summary. The only thing to add is that keeps coming up time again. We find in general that sort of parenting where it's been either absent or neglectful, depending on various circumstances, is associated with more head injury occurrences, loss of consciousness, and then that's associated with reactive aggression. And you get that as a route, and then you got another route. So if you have parenting that's explosive and use of force, then that's more associated with getting your own way through utilizing force and violence. So therefore that's another route into crime. So in a way, you've seen the crucible of the development of unhelpful and behavior towards others early on, and in the large scale studies I'm aware of, there is this sort of tendency towards brain injury being associated with a more reactive, impulsive type behaviors, where we can take account of it if we know about it in some kind of way. So we're thinking about wearable technology and that sort of thing as well. But anyway, there were also maybe other things to be brought up another time, but that's thank you. I just also want to mention Hope also supports the Pink Concussions Network in another role she has there, which has been looking at domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and bringing more focus to that. And that'll be at the there'll be a workshop in the International Brain Injury Association meeting in July online to do with intimate partner violence, which is another huge issue because there's a victim and perpetrator, but many victims. And in our work in women in prisons, finding huge amounts of women have had domestic violence related anoxic injuries and brain trauma. And so these and in the UK, the Home Office have just released or in process of releasing a report asking police to get trained in understanding brain injury in context of domestic violence for the victims of or the recipients of domestic violence. So it's very much emerging on the agenda. But I think, as Tom reminds us, it's important to check on whether that actually gets the right kind of uptake in things like vulnerability assessments, in terms of support for victims, and also support to try to change behavior of perpetrators, so that things stop escalating. And there's a nice work in trying to de-escalate kind of behavioral issues kind of over time. And I guess that's all we have time for today. But just to say thank you very much to our speakers. It's lovely to see the only other person in the audience that's on my screen now is Lynn, and you've been doing lovely work in this area for quite a while. So thank you very much for triggering all of this work, Lynn, with your wonderful previous research. And so thank you very much for participating today, and giving us this really good sets of flavor of traumatic lives in which there can be emotional dysregulation and brain injury, but there are toolkits and ways of supporting and trying to increase practice to empower people, but also including the police to be able to offer solutions. So thank you very much, and hope you have the rest a good weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Stay safe. Bye.
Yes. Bye.